International Relations, podcast lecture number 11, Postcolonialism. Postcolonialism is a school of thought that has made its entry into international relations at the end of the 1980s, early 1990s. It is particularly influenced by the work of Edward Said, but also by several schools of thought in feminism, post-structuralism, and other critical theories. Central in the concept of post-colonialism is the post-colonialism. We have gone from an era in which the colonial project was a dominant global project to one in which we basically dropped the whole idea together, in which having a colony is no longer a legitimate form of practice. So we are, in one sense, post our colonial order. On the other hand, post-colonialism points towards the fact that a lot of practices in world politics still resemble and echo the colonial project. To give some insight in what the colonial project was, let's see where it comes from and how it creates different colonial subjects. So, colonialism, starting in the 15th or 14th century, has had different phases. In the first phase, colonialism was mostly a practice of mercantilist monopoly trade and plunder, meaning that the project was to conquer a country, or in the case of Latin America, a continent, and extract as much as possible from it, which is valuable for the crown. Right? So it is a project of self-enrichment. In the case of Latin America, that had a lot to do with gold and silver, etc., etc. In this project, the colonial subject, the people that were ruled over, were mainly understood in terms of slaves. The second phase of the colonial project started in the early 19th century up to the late 19th century, and was a phase in which free trade was increasingly stimulated and allowed for. What happened in practice is that in the colonies, plantations were set up that were producing raw materials, particularly fruits, sugar, coffee, etc., etc., that were meant for the free market. Those plantations were obviously not ruled by local colonial subjects, but the colonial subjects were allowed to work there under pretty dire circumstances, but not under the circumstances of formal slavery. So this is an emancipating move, in a sense, that allowed the colonies to integrate into world capitalism, but without a strong sense of emancipation or agency. The third phase started in late 19th century and passed on until after World War II, and is a phase in which there was a substantial amount of capital investment, in which Western states invested a lot in productive processes, in factories, in infrastructure, railroads, etc., etc., but also in education, medicine, government institutions, etc., etc. So this was a phase in which there was really a sense of uplifting the colonial subject, emancipating her, so that the colonials, to stay in that parlance, can learn how to take care of themselves. Right. So there's a very strong pedagogical, paternalizing, if not condescending tone here. The idea that we're going to teach you how to be free, democratic, and civilized. aptly summarized in the famous white man's burden. It is our plight as Western states, as colonial overseers, to help our fellow humans in the colonies to become as civilized, rational, and well off as ourselves. Well, after World War II, the colonial project came to a halt, and we saw a massive process of decolonization. It has to be said, Latin America had decolonized already in the 19th century under a quite different set of circumstances, but the rest of the world mostly decolonized after 1945, creating all of a sudden a completely new category of states, the so-called Third World. The first world obviously being the Western world, and the second world in that parlance being the Soviet Union, right? Interestingly, the first world and the second world were in a competition for who was the most modern and the best modern bloc. So the sudden appearance of the third world problematized the word modern, in the sense that all of a sudden we had a category of countries that we didn't recognize in terms of modern, and therefore became a problem, something of a category that has to be developed, the developing world. So with decolonization, the concept of development all of a sudden doesn't pop into existence, because it already was part and parcel of the third phase of colonialism, but it was sort of redefined in terms of developing countries. So postcolonialism points towards continuity and change. Change in terms of the formal arrangements between colonizers and colonized countries, but continuity in the informal arrangements that inform the relations between the West and the non-West. So we've got hierarchies between developed and underdeveloped states. There is in practice a lot of inequality, and there is a lot of dependency. So in order to flesh out the post-colonial project, it is important to go back to the nexus between knowledge and power. As we've seen before, Foucault informs us that power is not just about coercion, but that real power in its deepest sense, actually comes through the internalization of power relations. So this means that there is a difference between who we think we are, our subjectivity, and who we really are. Because our subjectivity, the who we think we are, is not something that is autonomous from power relations, but rather comes from power relations. The where we are in power relations, how we've grown up in them, has come to constitute who we are as persons and how we see the world. And this also means that acting upon our subjectivity, if we just go on and act upon the world out of who we think that we are, we'll find ourselves reinforcing power relations, be it from the bottom, be it from the top. But we do not necessarily feel it that way, because we've grown up in power relations. They sort of become difficult for us to see, to grasp. It's like the water that a fish swims in. It is not something that you can sort of distance yourself from very easily. So power relations have become naturalized, and this works for two sides. You've got, of course, in power relations something of a dominant position and a marginal position. And the naturalization of power relations makes those two positions be seen in slightly different terms. If you are in the dominant, and it should be said that we are never simply in one or the other position, right? Where there are all kinds of social arrangements in which we can be dominant, but also part of other arrangements in which we can be slightly in the marginal, etc., etc. It's always a complex mix of social ways of being. But if you are in the dominant, what will happen is that you'll tend to understand your privileged position not as privilege, but as a natural given, right? That's saying, well, yeah, this is just the world that I live in, and it's just the way it is, right? This has beautifully been put by a famous IR scholar, Karl Deutsch, who argued that being in power is the ability not to have to question yourself. So the articulation of being in power is not to have to doubt. Right? That's the experience of power. Being in the marginal means exactly the opposite. It means what W.E.B. Du Bois called having a double consciousness. If you are in the marginal, you'll be constantly aware of the gaze of the dominant. You'll be looking at yourself through the eyes of the dominant, constantly judging yourself for not upholding that standard. So, interesting here is that both the dominant and the marginal position reinforce the naturalness of the dominant, but in different ways. The dominant reinforces its own position by taking it completely for granted, and the marginal reinforces the dominant position by taking it as a perspective through which the marginal condemns itself. Right. Okay, so back to Orientalism. Orientalism, in essence, is a theory about knowledge, how knowledge relates to power. And it focuses particularly on the role of power in representation. So the idea is that the way in which we represent, think, imagine the non-West actually reinforces power relations with those former colonies and makes those power relations perpetuate. This has been put forward first by Edward Said in his famous book Orientalism, which deals with the Western representations of the East, the Middle East in particular. And Edward Said argues that representations that we have of the Middle East are neither true nor irrelevant. It's not just that we walk around with either the right picture in our mind of the Middle East or with, well, just an arbitrary picture, and that is a non-problem. Rather, he shows that there is a logic involved in the representation of the Middle East in the Western mind. That logic has to do with something that you could call mirroring, namely that how we represent the other is a reversal of how we see ourselves. Right. And this means that there's a whole bunch of representations that we have for others, like the Middle East, that are actually more statements about who we think that we are than statements about who they actually are. So you can make a huge list, but just name a couple of representations that we have of the East. Is that it's uncivilized, that it's irrational, that it's overly sexual, etc., etc., etc. For current examples, you could draw from the way in which we understand Islam nowadays. And you can use exactly these kind of forms of representations to identify Western preoccupation with Islam. But also there are a set of positive, you could call it positive, but we associate them positively, right? Representations of the East as exotic, as colorful, as beautiful, right? So it's not that it's necessarily just negative. It is as a it can be positive, but then again, not in its own terms, but once again as a sort of a mirror of how we experience our own daily lives, and the grayness of the Northwestern European experience. Okay, one of the ways in which this post-colonial way of thinking articulates itself is through our thinking about development. Right. Western representations of the developing world follows lines that are very close to Said's work. And central is a sort of an implicit norm that we are the standard of what is good. That's not being said very much, except by very neoliberal authors, but it is implied in most of our Western thinking about development. So deviance from the norm of the Western standards of living are problematic, must be addressed, right? And they must be resolved somehow. This means that we start off with an understanding of the other in terms of A, being non-Western, and B, that being the problem. So being underdeveloped therefore presents itself to us as a issue that has to be resolved, but because they are underdeveloped, they can't resolve it. It is us who have to address the problem. This is a discourse that is ubiquitous in thinking about development, namely that agency lies not with the third world, but with us. Without us resolving their issues just won't be resolved, and they will remain in a state of perpetual poverty, hunger, etc., etc. So here you see very, very strong resonances of the white man's burden. The idea that if we want to emancipate, well, if the third world wants to become like us, which they naturally will, and which actually should be the natural outcome of their historical trajectory, the only way that we can get there is by us helping them to achieve that. Another trait of this set of representation is that we understand the third world or the non-West mostly in terms of victims and perpetrators. Usually along the line of 90% of the population is a horrible victim of exploitation, of hunger, has no ability to change that, is completely dependent on us. And then there is this 10% of the people in that country that are just greedy, selfish, extremely rich exploiters, oppressors, thieves, etc., etc., etc. So we understand non-Western societies in terms that are completely torn between those that are completely powerless and those that are completely in power. This is best seen by, for instance, asking questions such as, well, when is the last time we've seen a representation in Western media of African middle classes? Right. The idea of a middle class in Africa is something that doesn't resonate at all with Western understanding of what Africa is, and therefore is not being picked up, not being used, not being represented at all in our Western media. That doesn't mean that this can't change, but certainly there is it falls outside of the categories that we think Africa in, and therefore doesn't make a lot of sense. Often you see that there's this element of exoticness that is sort of forming also a backdrop. Right. And the exoticness sort of providing the sense of possibility, the sense of beauty, the idea of these are noble savages, that there's a beautiful world that they live in, a natural, sumptuous world, and if we can just help them to become civilized or whatever, then they'll be able to appreciate the beauty that God has given them, so to say. So, development thinking has both this element of problemizing the other and of making the other exotic. The same kind of logic you can find in the nowadays very popular discourse on failed states. Failed states being a discourse that came up in the 1990s and has become particularly popular amongst policy circles, United Nations, etc., etc. The idea is that we talk about states that are no longer capable of fulfilling their state obligations in a substantial way. Cases in point, obviously, always being Somalia first. Then we have countries such as the Congo, and we can move that list all the way up to even Mexico or Colombia. The idea of failed states is therefore a very normative concept, and it shows something of how Western the idea of sovereignty is. That being a sovereign state doesn't have to do simply with being some form of a state, but that it implies very strong norms about how you organize that state, how that state should function, what the micro apparatuses are through which the state articulates itself, etc., etc., etc. So it shows from a post-colonial perspective how Western the concept of the state is, how it is coming from lines of thoughts such as those of Max Weber, who understood the modern state in terms of being a highly efficient bureaucratic system that is impartial, that is not giving to certain social groups and not to others, but that is only focused on a universal category of citizens, that is functioning purely rationally, etc., etc. A very Enlightenment kind of thinking the state. And from this Weberian concept of the state, we end up calling states that organize differently failed, in other words, inferior. Right? And we use concepts such as corrupt or tribal, client-patron networks, and words as failed. Two things are important here, right? The failed state discourse is a way of closing up rather than opening up complex, faraway realities. Right? By calling Somalia a failed state, we do not have an obligation of trying to figure out how then, if this state is so horribly failed, it is able to continue to exist. And it is able to continue to function in many ways. Right? So that's very interesting to think about how a concept such as failed states is practically purely dismissive and not interested at all in what alternative ways of organizing the state could possibly be. And simultaneously, it is once again reinforcing the idea of a lack of agency, right? The only thing that they can do there is be warlords and be violent, etc., etc. But otherwise, there's no way that they're going to get out of this conundrum except for our Western plight. If we help them through sanctions, through help, through aid, whatever you want to do. The third aspect that comes out of postcolonial theory is the idea of tourism, which discloses the other side of this Western non-Western relations, the idea of this exoticness, right? Because tourism comes with a whole world of representations of the other, not so much based on poverty or the need for help, but rather on images of servility, sensuality, and luxury, right? The idea that there is a whole bunch of friendly, attractive, beautiful natives in some faraway, exotic place, preferably with palm trees and beaches, that are just only too happy to serve as pina coladas, right? And that is sort of a natural world in which there is very little evil. There is no sense of corruption, but rather there are those natural beings in their natural habitat, and they're just lovely to look at and to be served by. So here we have a whole image of noble savages. We do a lot of that when we come back from Thailand or wherever we go, and we say that how friendly those people are. That sort of invokes this whole idea of that there's those people that are just friendly and they're just happy to serve Western tourists, right? So this is a relatively optimistic or positive set of representations of the other, but still, of course, not taking at all the other in their own terms, right? And particularly staying blind to the fact that how we represent them and how that representation actually works. They are friendly, in contrast to the French, who are well known for not being very friendly to tourists. In the third world, you'll find that you're usually being received extremely friendly. How that being friendly doesn't come out of a natural category of them being friendly, but rather is reinforced by the tourist industry, which forces them to align to the image that we have of them. So the hard economy of tourism remains hidden to our eye because we're on holiday. We don't want to think about that kind of stuff, and all that we see is how they try to overcharge us or whatever. Right? That's how we see that, the ways in which we see them relating to the tourist economy. Okay, so if the core of the problem is, or one of the cornerstones of the problems is attributing a lack of agency to them, what can we do? What is possible? What are possible ways out of this practice of post-colonial power relations? Well, it's complex because in first instance there was an idea of, well, you know, we are now becoming decolonized in the third world, so let's embrace our identities as Africans, as Latin Americans, as Asians, etc., etc., and articulate our true being. Turned out that life wasn't so simple. Identity is not something that you simply have. It comes out of social practice. And therefore the Western engagement with the non-West, the Western representations of the non-West, have shaped what it is to be non-Western as well as Western. Those things have become inseparable. And therefore there are no authentic identities that we can simply link into or relate to. Whereas Fanon has once put it famously, the Negro is not any more than the white man. Those categories are not in themselves authentic anymore because they come out of mutual sets of representations. So this problematizes resistance. The dominant and the marginal are not dichotomous. What we think we are comes out of our relations. So this means that a simple fighting white domination doesn't make things work. It doesn't lead necessarily to successful resistance. What you see is that and there's a lot of that coming nowadays in IR, that resistance often comes in the form of articulating marginal voices, trying to articulate that which gets lost in these articulations of the non-West by the West, etc. So this works through storytelling, through having a questioning way of thinking about the world, through initiating dialogues, etc., rather than by fighting the Western domination, say. Some thoughts about international relations as an academic project in this context. Now, IR studies world politics, but it is itself not free from a perspective. Right? IR is a distinctly Western academic project, meaning that it was born in the West. Its first chair in international politics was in Aberystwyth, Wales. IR from there on grew rapidly in England, in the United States, continental Europe, etc., etc. So it is a Western located project that has now substantial branches in the non-West, but still is permeated with concepts, with ideas that are very Western. So we're doing science. We're trying to articulate something of a rational science, etc., etc., etc. So IR understands the world through Western theories, Western concepts, etc., etc. And therefore, you get this very interesting conundrum that on the one hand, IR seeks to study world politics, the politics of the world, but simultaneously does so from the perspective that happens to be politically dominant in world politics. And this makes non-Western IR hardly visible. Most of what we see typically of non-Western IR is what you could call periphery work. The idea being that at the core, Western world, we do good work, we can publish in peer reviews, etc., etc. We are climbing the ladder of academic knowledge production, and in the periphery, they're just lagging behind. They're not as good as we are. Basically, they're a bad copy of the original. So you see a lot of critiques pointing towards academicians in the non-Western world. Not so much from the core, but from the periphery itself, saying like, oh, all that we do is just, your basic realism and liberalism, but we're not even properly educated enough to get to the stage of real theorizing, and we are just backward in our understanding of the world. So this idea of non-Western IR being a bad copy of the original has been resonating quite substantially for the last 20 years or so. It is only, I would say, since the 2003-04 that we see a rise of real articulations of something that you would call non-Western IR, which seeks to articulate alternative ways of thinking, alternative understandings of sovereignty, alternative methodologies, alternative forms of knowledge. For instance, Lili Ling, who works at I think New York University, she's been articulating in several works a Taoist understanding of international relations, which differs from Western international relations both in content, in methodology, and in purpose, but still is able to have a conversation or dialogue with Western IR in a meaningful way. So these modes of knowledge production remain are growing, but remain relatively marginal. So, to end with 3 questions. One of the critiques of postcolonialism is that it assumes a sort of a static history, right? The idea being that, well, we've overcome the political project of colonialism, and now still nothing has really happened, right? One could wonder whether that's still, this is all still so relevant. We've passed our colonial project by 60 or 70 years, right? Can we still assume that this colonial thinking is so deeply engraved in our beings that it still identifies who we are, who they are, etc., etc., right? Why is this colonial thinking still so incredibly important if the project lies so far behind us? Secondly, given that the West, we in the West, we speak the world into existence, right? This is the idea of representations and power. By articulating our Western worldview, we affirm the post-colonial order as it is, right? What can we do? What kind of options are open to Western scholars, thinkers, interested individuals to change the rules of the game when we are so much in power? And thirdly, about tourism. We've grown accustomed to the fact that we can travel the global south for our leisure, and that the other, they, can't do so vice versa. And that's interesting, because we've got a flow of relations between the West and the non-West that is highly asymmetrical in this regard. So that makes possible the question of thinking about how does tourism actually affect North-South relations? How does tourism actually affect the relations of the West with the rest, so to say?